Right, well, my starting point in this talk is the work that's been led by the University College London Constitution Unit on border polls, Irish unification referendums. We set up a working group on this in 2019, and it produced an interim report late last year. The report's essentially about the process for getting to a united Ireland and for deciding what it might look like. It's not a blueprint for anything, it's more an agenda for informed debate about the subject. And we are starting to have quite a big debate, but there's often a lack of information. But after I talk about the report, I'll suggest some ideas about handling the discussion of the issues that are raised in it and the wider debate about our political future. We're potentially at a time politically in Northern Ireland, more widely, when many of the sands are shifting. A majority for Irish unity, though, I'll suggest, may not be at all imminent. And there are real dangers of sterile and destructive politics if all of the attention is focused on union against unity. In the short term, I'll suggest we need an urgent effort to recreate a more positive political culture, in particular to carry forward the work of the Good Friday Agreement, and to develop a programme to fulfil its broader objectives. Those objectives are neglected at the moment, but they're still extremely relevant to providing a better future here. And I will suggest that is true whatever your view of ultimate constitutional destiny. They're on a critical path to a united Ireland as to other outcomes. So that's the really urgent issue, but we do need to discuss unity and we do need to discuss other possibilities imaginatively. And I'll suggest finally that this new thinking requires a real effort from people outside active politics in Northern Ireland to produce ideas and analysis. So let me turn first to talk about the working group and initially how we set it up. The first piece of work that the Constitution Unit did on border polls was a discussion paper that I wrote a couple of years ago. It seemed right to look at those questions because the issue of early unity was starting to be discussed in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, and we were also seeing a number of opinion polls that, taken at face value, suggested a majority might not be far off. I'll come back to those polls later. But what would be involved in the process of unification under the Good Friday Agreement was at that stage quite largely unexplored. It would be disastrous, we thought, look at the Brexit parallels, for a poll to be called without serious analysis and discussion about the key issues, and without there being on the table before the vote a clear plan about what a united Ireland might look like, and how to get there, and how to involve all traditions in the island in its design. The agreement sets out the principle that there should be Irish unity if there is a simple majority in support in both parts of the island without external impediment. And it says the Secretary of State must start the process by calling a border poll if he thinks there's a majority in the north for unity. That judgment is potentially a very difficult one. There's no further guidance on how the Secretary of State should decide. And beyond that, the agreement only says very little about either the route to united Ireland or what it would look like. Those questions weren't considered in 1998. The agreement negotiations were barely touched on the constitutional issues. A recent article by one of my Irish counterparts in the agreement negotiations, Rory Montgomery, brings that out. The participants all bought into the principle in the Downing Street Declaration of 1993 that unity was a matter for consent in the two parts of the island of Ireland, with the British government having no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland, Pache Mr. Rees-Mogg. But time for negotiation was short, and there was really no interest in having difficult debates about issues that were seen as unlikely to arise for some decades, if ever. I don't think the arrangement for putting the trigger into the hands of the Secretary of State through a border poll was really discussed at all, though it's not obvious what other mechanism could have been set up. Anyway, when UCL published my discussion paper, they thought it raised questions worth going into further, and we were able to put together a group composed largely of political science and legal academics from the universities in Belfast and Dublin, as well as UCL. This project was intended to be a neutral study, not a work of advocacy. So collectively, the group was neither for nor against a border poll, neither for nor against a united Ireland. If I declare it, that's in line with my personal position. I think we get hung up too much on constitutional forms, and we ought to give more effort to finding arrangements that as large a number of people as possible can identify with, And also arrangements that give us good government and prosperity. This is a personal hobby horse. It's something that our current system doesn't take seriously enough, and I think we suffer, and political stability suffers as a result. And that's the reason that I was involved in setting up the think tank Pivotal. I'd suggest that the executive would have been much more resilient against collapse in 2017 if it had on its belt a substantial record of achievement and worthwhile projects in hand. At all events, the group's work was mainly focused on suggesting processes before, during, and after border polls that would give the best chance of political stability in the new state, if that was the choice, and through the transition to it, the how you get there bit. We only looked at the substance, the shape of a unified state, to identify the questions, what decisions need to be made during the process. We tried to listen to the widest possible range of views, though there were some people on the unionist side who thought it was dangerous to get into these questions at all, an attitude we respect, even if we think it was probably the wrong judgment. We produced our interim report last November. It is absolutely enormous, and I don't kid myself that many people have read it, but we have had some useful responses nevertheless. We'll produce a final version in the next few months. I don't think it will be radically different, and we'll try then to get the message out to a wider audience. I should say we're not putting the report forward as any sort of last word on the issues it covers. In some areas, it's really the first word. The issues have not been seriously scrutinized, but it does point up a lot of areas where more facts and analysis are required, and all of it requires more debate. Let me turn to three of the key areas in the report. What I say is a personal take on it, not that of the whole group, but I think it's entirely consistent with our findings. We cover a lot more ground than I'm going to outline today, and I'm happy to pick up other points on the report in the questions. But the first key issue, which is the first in time, is when should the Secretary of State call a poll? Under the agreement and under the UK law reflecting it, the Secretary of State, as I said, must call a poll if it seems to him likely that a majority of those who voted in it would favour unity. And he can call one at any time. The first observation here is that a great deal turns even now on the Secretary of State commanding trust in the way he keeps under review his duty to call a poll, because the constitutional status provisions, for many people, are the keystone of the agreement, the keystone of the 1998 settlement. The Secretary of State is the person charged with ensuring they're observed. The courts, in a case brought by Raymond McCord, have underlined the need for honesty and propriety in the Secretary of State's decisions. Any suggestion that the decision is being influenced by considerations of, say, resisting an independence referendum in Scotland would be open to legal action. But it would also challenge the government's credibility seriously, and that could have really serious real-world consequences. And this concern could quickly become important if there were a few polls suggesting a bare majority for unity. Now, there are various sorts of evidence the Secretary of State might look at. The main ones we identified were, unsurprisingly, election results, opinion polls, and other expressions of political opinion, like assembly votes. But all of these are very imperfect indicators, as I'll outline. And in those circumstances, we couldn't properly try to suggest any sort of simple formula, any precise weighting of the different sorts of evidence that the Secretary of State ought to draw on. Each type of evidence really needs to be assessed in its context at the time. Now, opinion polls have come nearest to suggesting a majority for unity, but it's especially difficult to be confident about them because different methodologies give strikingly different results. At present, online polling, which is generally conducted by only one company in Northern Ireland, Lucid Talk, tends to show significantly more support for unity than other sorts of polling. The Lucid Talk poll for the Sunday Times last month showed 42% favouring Irish unity now, which I think was 3 percentage points down on a similar poll last year, and 47% against. But interview-based surveys, like the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, generally pick up significantly less support for unity. So the 2019 survey showed only 25% who would vote for unity in a referendum tomorrow, and 51% against. Now, the methodologies used in surveys like NALT are generally considered by specialists to be the most reliable. although there's been a good bit of discussion about the rival merits of different sorts of polling in Northern Ireland circumstances. For example, picking up people who are hesitating to tell a pollster a preference, or who typically don't vote, but who might do in a border poll. And we've heard of shy nationalists and scundered unionists. There are no clear answers to these questions. If the polls and surveys agreed, they'd be more convincing, but it's hard to argue that the online polls alone come near to clinching the argument. And in any event, as the head of the Northern Ireland polling company Lucid Talk has said, it's hard to put a lot of confidence in the predictive capacity of polling before we've had a debate on the issues, perhaps before we've had a campaign, because opinion often shifts radically during campaigns, as it did in the Scottish independence referendum, although worldwide it tends to become more cautious, I understand. So that doesn't make the Secretary of State's decision any easier. The other main sort of evidence for him to look at is election results. Conceptually, you might say they're less appropriate indicators because people vote for parties without necessarily endorsing all of their platform. But you don't get the same problems about methodology, and you do get a single result. At all events, election results don't at present suggest anything like a majority for unity or for an early poll. We're a long way from 50% support for nationalist parties, about 38% in 2019. Numbers of seats in the Assembly or in Parliament are clearly less good evidence of how the public might vote, given the vagaries of the electoral system, and particularly the Westminster electoral system. And so an Assembly vote might not directly address the Secretary of State's duty either, but we do think that an Assembly vote clearly would change the terms of the debate very significantly. Depending on the circumstances, it might be seismic. This is one of the cases where we suggest the Secretary of State might need to call a poll, whatever his assessment of the exact outcome. But that doesn't seem likely in the near future. And short of that, the decisions are very difficult. As I say, there's no simple formula to be offered. If opinion became more finely balanced, we suggested in the group that the Secretary of State would benefit from independent expert advice. But looking at the evidence as we saw it, we concluded that none of it suggests there's a majority for unity now, fairly obviously, and that a majority for unity doesn't appear imminent. And for that reason, we don't suggest it's time that the governments need to work together to prepare a plan for referendums. Any decision to do that would change the political debate in Northern Ireland very radically. All the focus would then be on union versus unity and away from other issues, which has potentially damaging consequences. Our next key set of recommendations was about the process for getting to a united Ireland. We concluded that under the agreement, it's inescapably a majority decision, that is 50% plus one in each part of the island, whether to have unity. And as the agreement says, with no external impediment. Preferences elsewhere in the UK don't count. Historically and politically, the agreement couldn't have said otherwise. We wouldn't have had an agreement, I think, if that hadn't been the provision. But many other parts of the agreement, as Seamus Mallam pointed out, emphasise consensus among different political traditions. The agreement itself was reached by a consensus threshold. It provided for power-sharing government on key issues with cross-community support. And that model responded to the received wisdom of 50 years or so now that you can't achieve stable government in Northern Ireland without a large measure of consensus. And the group therefore took the view that developing the form of a united Ireland, if ever that's the popular will, needed to pursue consensus principles as far as possible too. That's emphatically not to reintroduce a higher threshold for unity, if that's what a majority of voters in each jurisdiction want. But seeking consensus about the form of unity, and particularly as it bears on Northern Ireland, may be essential for the stability of the new state. It would be a great prize to have on the title deeds of a new unified Irish state the signatures of people representing a significant proportion of unionism. And if there were none, it might be a recipe for serious discontent. So we make suggestions for processes aiming at a measure of consensus between the different traditions in the island about the shape of a united Ireland. And that's one of the reasons that the report is so long. These processes are very complicated, reconciling the majority principle about constitutional status and the desirability of consensus about what follows is a real conundrum. In the abstract, the simplest arrangement would be for there to be a full planning for a united Ireland and engagement with all traditions on it before the referendums north and south, so the electorate would vote on a clear plan for the new state. And we outline what that process would involve as our first main option. But realistically, people campaigning for the Union are unlikely to divide their efforts between that campaign and planning for Irish unity. You will probably struggle to get any significant unionist engagement on the shape of a united Ireland until it's inevitable that that is going to be the destination. So we also looked closely at two configurations in which there'd be an attempt after the referendums to decide the principle of unity, where it's more likely that people on the pro-union side would participate, to seek consensus among all the traditions in Northern Ireland and in the south about the shape of the unified state. You would still need a plan in advance of the referendums. It'd be important, even in that case, to have informed debate during the campaign and a clear proposed model of a unified state from the pro-unity side. But that model would be subject to negotiation in the years following, aimed at finding consensus about the future. On one of these two configurations, the negotiation would take place before the transfer of sovereignty, and on the other, afterwards. And in both cases, there would be further referendums on the resulting plan. But the real complication here is that these negotiations will only work if there's no chance of them undoing the decision in favour of unity. Otherwise, unionists will, perhaps quite reasonably, be tempted simply to seek that outcome. The only way around this may be to have a default provision, a default unification plan that takes effect in the absence of consensus or of referendum approval. By definition, of course, that wouldn't be an agreed island. So there's nothing like a perfect solution. Our suggested models make for a complex, a challenging process with a lot of opportunity for the politics to go wrong. But it's often been through painfully elaborate mechanisms that we've resolved political differences in the past. These are first thoughts. The process of getting to unity requires a lot more attention. Ultimately, of course, it would require the British and Irish governments to work very closely together to keep the process on the rails. The final area I'll look at is the agenda of issues to be decided about the shape of a united Ireland. We don't, as I say, reach any conclusions on the substantive issues, besides indicating what we think will be within the terms of the agreement. But our main aim in Chapter 7 of the report was to set out what the key questions on the agenda would be. And I think we've done it in a more comprehensive and detailed way than has been done before. These are the issues, the debate, the process of engagement, the negotiation on either side of referendums has to encompass. Some of them are very big. They're of fundamental importance to the way the new state will be run, what people can hope for. In many cases, more information, more analysis is needed for them to be debated intelligently. But the debate really needs to start with the key values that would inform the structure of a united Ireland, and the report brings out some of those. The fundamental one is perhaps where the unity plan would be on a spectrum running between the minimalist extension of the current Irish constitution to encompass the north, which is obviously liable to be seen by unionists as a hostile takeover, perhaps others as well, and at the other end of the spectrum to the creation on a blank sheet of paper of the new state, which is clearly a very big enterprise. More concretely, we identify issues around how far the 1998 agreement should govern the structure of a united Ireland. It has very few provisions that explicitly say that it should do that, but as a matter of politics and principle, it's hard to say that its fundamentals have no application. We look at questions about how Northern Ireland will fit into the architecture of the unified state. Do we have a simple unitary 32-county state? Do we have a state with a devolved Northern Ireland, a mirror image of what we have at the moment? Or do we have a federal state? We look at the possibility of a long transition to Irish unity. There are issues the two governments would primarily negotiate, and perhaps the key one there is finance, because a deficit would inevitably arise in the short term, at least whatever your views of the economics of a united Ireland. We look at EU issues that would arise and some tricky questions about citizenship. And then there are issues about identity and the characteristics of the Irish state. Questions like, should the rules change on language? from the current Irish model. It gives primacy to the Irish language in some cases. Flags, other symbols. Should Ireland rejoin the Commonwealth? What should its defence posture be? Should the principle of neutrality carry over? Should it join NATO? Should there be some recognition of the British monarchy, even if only a symbolic one, as an entity to which many of the people in the new state would feel affinity? There's the question whether all these arrangements should be embodied in a new Irish constitution rather than simply being amendments to the existing Borden na hÉireann. And then we list some of the key individual policy questions that would arise around fusing institutions and policies. They'd loom much larger if a unitary model was chosen. Devolution might avoid some of them, but there are big questions here around policing, around health and welfare provision, the different systems of law and the courts. And we look at wider relations, in agreement terms, the strand 3 issues. There's a lot here that needs a lot more discussion. We don't set all these problems out so as to suggest that a united Ireland is impossibly difficult to achieve. Indeed, we highlight some of the characteristics, the factors of the shared heritage between the two parts of the island that may facilitate unity. But it shouldn't be assumed that all these problems can be satisfactorily resolved simply by a sufficient political will. And I don't think any of the issues that we've outlined are just detail or geek issues to be looked at only after the decision in principle. If you judge by recent accounts, this was one of the flaws in the British government's approach to Brexit. Lots of people told the people making the decisions that there were serious problems around Ireland, but they chose to see those as matters of detail to be ironed out once the grand design was settled. And that's another Brexit error not to be repeated. The group also looks briefly at what might be offered in the context of Northern Ireland remaining in the UK. We couldn't really do, within the remit we'd given ourselves, more than nod at these questions, because the proponents of union could simply rest on the status quo. So no issues necessarily arise to be dealt with in that context, as they do in the case of unity. Now, you might think that people who favour the union would want to propose reforms so as to meet the concerns of some of those who favour unity. And that's really what the politics of border polls requires. It's different from the politics we've known. Parties need to appeal not just to their own section of the community, as most of the main ones tend to do at the moment, but across the whole field, and in particular to people in the centre ground. And you would need arguments and people to make those arguments convincingly in that context. And logically, this is where unionism might be. So that was my summary of the report. I now want to move on to the second part of these thoughts, which is essentially, in the light of the report, what should we do? What I say from now on is purely personal. These are not questions that the working group has looked at. But as I say, we need a debate, an informed debate, around the issues in this report, certainly. Is that all? We need to think about this in the current political context. There's a sense around that we're at a turning point now. Politics have changed away from the model we've operated under, or sought to get back to over the last 20 years. For a time over that period, the pursuit of the agreement was really the central feature of politics. It embodied a plan, and it had behind it an idealism and an energy and a hope that a great many people in the community bought into. And the agreement transcended the binary split, at least as regards the medium-term future of Northern Ireland. But the institutional parts of the agreement are now largely implemented, and in execution they seem rather tarnished. The institutions have comparatively few agreements to their credit, and they're not held in high public esteem. Many people have put a lot of effort into keeping them going, taking grave political risks, indeed, to do that, and I don't mean to denigrate that achievement at all, because it's fundamental to doing anything else. But there's undoubtedly public disappointment over the delivery record of the institutions. And beyond that, the larger objectives of the agreement around reconciliation, recognition of rights, identity, equality, prosperity, strengthening North-South and East-West relations, these are not now seriously being pursued. The various attempts to shore up the agreement structures over the years have tended to neglect these broader foundations. They've been essentially institutional sticking plaster, which was perhaps understandable enough in the context, but in the long term, it leaves a gap. Can we go back to the progress that was slowly being made in the best years of the post-agreement period? The context is changing fast. The consensus between the main parties we had in the most positive years has leached away, and they're likely to continue fractured because of the way that Brexit has played out here. Political dialogue moving into the old binary model of union versus unity through proxy issues around the protocol. And the sands are shifting elsewhere. Unionism is slowly losing its majorities. It may lose another one in the results of the census being conducted this month. And there are regular demonstrations of the lack of affinity that the rest of the UK feels for Northern Ireland. And then in a few months we may see Scotland on the move constitutionally as well. And almost everyone in Northern Ireland mistrusts the British government. Now, there was never a golden age of perfect trust, of course, but there is now massively less than there was at one stage. For many people, there was once a sense that, however imperfect, Westminster offered a safety net. It provided the prospect of basically competent and honest government if local efforts failed. Looking at London over the last few years, the competence and honesty is now much less harder to see, though there's still the financial dependence. And all of these factors leave unionism, in particular, struggling for direction, and they mean that looking to the British and Irish governments for political leadership that they've often provided in the past is very difficult. And besides London's reputation here, its relations with Dublin are in a poor state. Of course, the sands may be shifting in Dublin as well, with Sinn Féin riding high in the polls. And finally, we see again a more active American interest in Northern Ireland. And we have the Assembly election next year, with the risk of further upsets for good or ill. Especially after a hard campaign around the protocol, Sinn Féin emerges as the largest party with the right to nominate the First Minister. What would unionism do? And if the old two-block model continues to slip away with the rise of the centre-ground parties, as we saw in the elections in 2019, we're in a different sort of dynamic, and that raises questions about the way the current arrangements treat non-aligned members. To look on the gloomy side, I think you would have to say there is a clear risk now that we may, in the next few months or in the next few years, really see the unwinding of the Good Friday Agreement settlement. And if it falls over this time, if the institutions fall over, it may be very hard to get them functioning again. Now, a sizable number of people seem to think that we have reached the turning point and that unity, Irish unity, is the answer to it. As I said, we haven't heard a lot about how we will get there or what it will look like, but it often seems that these are the only people with a plan. But is Irish unity the immediate answer to all the challenges we face? I suggest it's not, for two reasons. First of all, as I say, the working group didn't conclude that a majority for unity exists or is imminent. The polling evidence at the moment is either against or strongly against, depending on the polls you look at. There's nothing like a majority at the moment for political parties with a declared policy of unity. Is this likely to change suddenly? Well, the issue now looks likely to be decided in the centre ground, which may loom much larger in the Assembly after May. The parties there have traditionally not gone for constitutional big bangs. The latest poll, conducted online in January, offers some insight into centre ground voter opinion. Had 26% favouring remaining in the Union, 38% favouring a united Ireland, and 36% undecided, which is quite a large number. It also suggested that only 75% of SDLP voters would favour unity at the moment. Opinion, of course, may move when we get into a discussion about the shape of a united Ireland. In the north, but also in the south, where the polls have generally shown a majority is favouring unity in principle. But how will it evolve? We need to bear in mind that unity on any plan is likely to involve disruptive change, with potential consequences for many people in the north and in the south, and losers as well as winners. And it's quite likely that the debate will lead people to be cautious, as often happens in constitutional referendums. Indeed, one way of reading Seamus Mallon's last book is the people convinced of in principle of the desirability of Irish unity might still reasonably conclude they should vote against it for the time being if they thought the process of getting there was likely to be a nightmare. And with 50% plus one majorities in both jurisdictions, that's what it might well be. Reasoning of that sort might start to influence votes. The other reason for not putting all the eggs in the unity basket, even if you firmly believe that's where we want to be, is that unity can't be the universal solvent for all of Northern Ireland's problems. There'll still be a need to govern with consensus in the north unless and until the fractures in our society disappear. There will still be grave economic difficulties. There'll still be struggling public services. There'll still be issues about the past. Indeed, the road to unity could exacerbate many of these problems. At all events, looking at the present context, we may not see a majority for unity for a considerable time, and there's a real danger here. If we face a prolonged standoff with politics essentially sterile, even if the institutions survive, where the largest parties take up the battle lines, the traditional battle lines of unity versus union. And in that scenario, we risk the deterioration through neglect, if nothing more, of the social and economic fabric, polarization deepening in the community, young people deserting, and the substantial international goodwill that is still latently out there ebbing away. So unless you believe that we will get unity in the short term and that it will solve all the problems the 1998 settlement aimed to resolve, I suggest the debate on the constitutional future needs to address what's most urgent. As I've argued in a blog recently, the great immediate priority is to seek to revive the agreement and positive politics, to develop a new programme to fulfil the agreement's objectives around reconciliation, rights, equality, dealing with the past, building the economy, building prosperity. A great deal more could be done in that direction if there was the political will. I don't suggest simply combining the traditional shopping lists. We need a really thoughtful look at the policies. But work has been done inside and outside government on these issues. It's lacked the political will to implement it because partly it hasn't been brought together in a single programme as it was in 1998. Hence, it's made little impact on political or media discourse or public consciousness. I think an effort to revive the agreement is urgent now, and an effort to revive the principle of working together on all the problems we face, because as so often, we go forward or we go backwards in politics here, we don't stand still. And because I suggest making sure that Northern Ireland works is a necessary element in the advance of political agendas in whatever direction we're going. Political stability here is, I think, quite probably essential for successful Irish unity, as much as it is for a successful Northern Ireland within the Union. Voters contemplating nightmare scenarios, as I said a while ago, might be cautious. A thoroughly dysfunctional Northern Ireland, with many hostile unionists in it, might not seem to voters in the South to be an attractive immediate extension of their state. Even voters in the South who are convinced of the need for unity may prefer a model where Northern Ireland is insulated by separate institutions, but that needs those institutions to be functioning and stable. Nor will a dysfunctional Northern Ireland endear itself to the other island, whose attachment to us, as we discussed, is already doubtful. We risk ending up being unwanted by everyone. So that, I think, is the priority. That's not to say we should shelve all discussions about the longer-term dimensions. We do need to be thinking creatively about new arrangements for the longer term. Certainly, we need to debate the issues around unity in the working group report. As I've suggested, I've outlined the key ones, but there's an enormous agenda there. What a united Ireland state would look like, how we get there with the fullest buy-in. But we might be more adventurous as well. The working group's consideration was set in the context of the provisions of the agreement. But as I said, the agreement was arrived at without any serious thought as to what might in fact be entailed by Irish unity and the transition to it. And the agreement, as we've seen at St Andrews, can develop, though critically it has to do that by consensus. I'm emphatically not suggesting any unilateral initiatives here. But I do think we need to think imaginatively about hybrid constitutional forms that might better accommodate different identities. That is, forms that on the one hand could be regarded as the fulfilment of Irish unity, Northern Ireland becoming part of an Irish union, and on the other hand maintaining a British link. I don't think we should get hung up on heavily dated conceptions of the nation state. And this reflection needs to take place in the context of potential political change elsewhere in the UK, which may see Scotland and even Wales cease to be part of it. And in that event, arrangements are likely to be put in place for cooperation and coordination between the different elements of the former UK, possibly even structures of a confederal nature. And there are questions there of the part, therefore, that either or both parts of Ireland might play in that. If there's not an early move to independence, we may at some point see the UK government taking initiatives to change relationships within the devolved parts of the UK in order to shore up unity, though it's not clear whether any serious thought is proceeding in that direction at the moment. So we need to be imaginative. But let me just return to my hobby horse and say that in future constitution making, we really do need to have regard to how effectively any forms of government operate, rather than merely satisfying ourselves that the broad structures, whether for a united Ireland or otherwise, satisfy an overall political equation, because that aspect of the settlement may be essential. If they do achieve this sort of effectiveness, then they are likely to be a good deal more resilient. My final point is about who would do the thinking on, who should be doing the thinking now on a revised agreement programme and on the broader future. I don't think the political system, there are very worthy people operating throughout it, but I don't think it's going to produce us a lot of analysis, a lot of new ideas, a lot of daring proposals spontaneously. Though there are constructive people everywhere in the spectrum, they need help. The biggest parties are, to some degree, constrained by their backwards. But it's important the work starts to map out on what a revived agreement might look like, to provide an agenda for coherent public debate, and to raise aspirations. Poverty of ambition and a fatalism about what can be achieved have often inhibited progress here, and we need to break that spell. Now, you may say the governments ought to be looking at this. At the moment, they're unlikely to do so of their own accord. The British government in particular seems to have other priorities. On the revived agreement idea, I don't suggest a programme drawn up by outsiders will be accepted wholesale. The political questions need ultimately to be addressed by the political machine. But reasoned options for a programme to be drawn on as political conditions permit would, I think, have great value, could seriously influence the political debate in a positive direction. And given that we risk the institutions being in danger before long, a political crunch may be coming. Political crunches are often the occasions when new ideas are embraced. People are looking for new programmes, and it's worth starting this work now, I suggest. And since there's no sign of the governments beginning work themselves on the broader constitutional options, indeed we said in the working group that we didn't think that was yet appropriate, we also need reflection about the longer term from the non-official world, from civil society, if you like, including academia, the third sector, business, unions, think tanks. There's at present no broadly based framework for coordinating that sort of work. There are groups with aspirations to make things work better. There are initiatives, of course, under the Shared Island Programme. There are academics working in the field, including now the ARINS project. That's a welcome initiative, but it's Dublin-based. I think planning for reinvigorating the agreement and for wider developments needs to bring in people from the north, essentially for reasons of political acceptability, if nothing else, to be northern-based. So, breathlessly, I'll conclude. I've tried to suggest that we need debate, we need informed debate, we need new analysis to fit into it about our constitutional future, certainly about the issues raised by the working group around unity. But I've also suggested that saving the agreement, maintaining the institutions, renewing the drive to fulfill its underlying commitments is the essential foundation for any successful future. And for that, we need to broaden the debate, and this work will, I think, only get done if people outside politics and government in Northern Ireland provide the initial impetus, though it will certainly need the close involvement of the British and Irish governments, again coming together to work closely in harmony at some point. Anyway, thank you for listening.